When you see any of the recent Samsung Ultra phones, it can kind of seem like you're looking at that meme with the three identical Spider-Men. So realistically, if you're weighing up the S23 Ultra and S24 Ultra, chances are you're deciding if you want the very latest and greatest, or if it's better to save some cash with the older model. Because honestly, look, no one should be upgrading directly from S23 to S24. It's just not worth it, especially now that the days of generous Samsung trade-in offers are well and truly over. But look at the pricing of the S23 Ultra, under $900 in places like the US and well under £800 here in the UK, and compare it to the top ticket prices demanded by the S24 Ultra, and yeah, that's up to an extra quintet of Benjamins for two phones that are very much alike. So let's dive into the actual differences between these two and see whether the latest Ultra can justify the extra cash. I'm Alex Dobie, this is XDA TV, let's jump in. First off, although the S23 and S24 Ultra look almost identical from a distance, up close there are lots of subtle little differences that stand out. The S24 is just this great big blocky monolith. It really feels like the platonic ideal that Samsung has been working towards over the past few years. The S23, on the other hand, still retains some of its curves, notably on the display with this ever so slight angled edge here and a similarly curved back. Although I like the sharper appearance of the S24, I've got to say my hands do not. Between the sharper corners and the lack of that slight curve around the back, Samsung's taken a phone that was already not great ergonomically and moved it in a direction that's even more hostile to the human hand. The S24 is also framed in titanium, much like the latest iPhones, as opposed to the aluminium of the S23. Weight-wise, this doesn't change much, but it does mean the borders now have a matte finish, and in theory it should be at least a little bit more sturdy. The move to a completely flat screen also allows Samsung to trim down its borders just a little, most notably along the bottom, where the ever so slight chin area from the S23 is now more in line with the other bezels on the S24. And that also contributes to the S24 being just a little shorter too compared to its predecessor. But the much bigger deal here in my view is the display, not the bump to its peak brightness, which, let's be honest, you probably won't notice between these two phones. No, it's the move to Corning Gorilla Armor. This new smartphone glass promises to be more scratch resistant, so hopefully you won't start noticing those pesky hairline scratches as the months progress. But crucially, it's also way less reflective, meaning it's easier to see outside even at lower brightness levels. And even indoors, when placed next to the S23 or any other smartphone, you can tell you're fighting less with that ambient light. Seriously, using this will ruin you for any other smartphone display, and in a year of pretty reserved upgrades, this one's near the top of my list personally. The rest of the internal hardware hasn't really changed all that much, so let's just blitz through the stuff that actually matters. Last year's Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 for Galaxy is replaced with the newer Gen 3, and unlike the other S24 models, the Ultra uses Snapdragon in every country. Good news for all you Exynos haters out there. But unlike the move from S22 Ultra to S23 Ultra, there isn't such a big difference in performance between the Gen 2 and Gen 3 chips. And so, unless you're doing a lot of heavy gaming, stuff like Genshin Impact, chances are you're not going to notice all that much difference in the kind of day-to-day performance that actually matters, even if you talk about more casual mobile gaming. The base RAM gets a welcome upgrade to 12GB now, which you'd certainly expect for how expensive the S24 Ultra is. And much of the other core specs are unchanged, including the base storage, battery capacity, and charging speeds, whether wirelessly or over a wire. I also haven't noticed an appreciable difference in battery life between these two phones, which mainly just speaks to how much of a huge upgrade the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 was last year. Both of these are easily 2-day phones if you're only a moderate user, and I found it really hard to kill either of them off in under a day, even with excessive amounts of screen on time and on heavier travel days. What can I say? We're in a golden age of Android battery life right now. On the software side, the biggest differentiator for the S24, at least for now, is AI. Samsung's latest flagship comes packed with a fairly extensive loadout of Galaxy AI capabilities, which impress to varying degrees. The new on-device interpreter feature is generally accurate and fast, helping you out with translations in the real world. It's also built into the text messaging and dialer app too. For calls, despite a slight delay, I was surprised to find out how fluid of an experience this could actually be, although as I've said in some earlier videos, the text-based translation can get tripped up a bit by context, those contextual clues, especially when it comes from earlier in the conversation. Photo Assist builds on the features like reflection removal and background object erasure that were already in Samsung's Gallery app with the S23 series, with new capabilities like generative expansion and the ability to move objects and people around in your shot and intelligently fill the area where they once were. And the S24 also gets Google's Circle the Search capability, which lets you scan the contents of your display directly into Google. This is currently available just right now on the S24 and the Pixel 8 Pro. So while these Galaxy AI capabilities are exclusive to the S24 for now, Samsung does plan on bringing them to the S23 Ultra with a future update. The handful of other AI features like generative AI wallpapers aren't mentioned, but even if they're not there, I don't think that's a huge loss. In any case, that's all the major Galaxy AI features covered on the older model eventually, when Samsung decides to roll out that update. The only slight caveat is Samsung has left the door open to eventually charge for these AI features, so there is a possibility that you'll be reaching for your wallet to continue using Galaxy AI on an S23 after some point of time. And the S24 also has a software support advantage, having launched a year later and being given the promise of 7 years of Android OS updates that'll take it right through until 2031. The S23's 4-year commitment is nothing to sniff at, but it is considerably less given that we're already into year 2 of that support lifespan. Otherwise, the only differences I've seen in the software, bearing in mind my S23 Ultra is still running One UI 6, not the newer 6.1, is in animation and fluidity. The new version just seems to be tuned up a little bit better, but there's every chance the S23 will get all those benefits when update time rolls around. Otherwise, it's the exact same, pretty nice looking Samsung experience across both devices. So there's only really one important change coming to the camera setup going from S23 Ultra to S24 Ultra, and that's the Super Telephoto. After leaving this largely unchanged since 2021, Samsung has now swapped out its trusty 10 megapixel 10x shooter for a beefier 50 megapixel secondary telephoto at 5x. The reasons for doing this are pretty logical if you think about it. A larger sensor at 5x is just more practical for most people, and with that higher resolution you can zoom into 10, 20 or even 30 times on the few occasions where you might need that and still get pretty great results. Elsewhere, it's a copy-paste of last year's camera system, with a 200 megapixel primary ultra-wide and the same trusty 10 megapixel 3x telephoto that acts kind of like a stepping stone between the primary and the big boy 5x camera. One other notable difference is the fact the S24 Ultra can shoot Ultra HDR photos. Similar to an HDR video, an HDR photo saves additional brightness data to allow a compatible screen to display a greater variety in brightness levels, making the photo closer to what your eye actually sees in the real world. Samsung is using Google's Ultra HDR format, and there are other rival formats from Apple and also Oppo that are supported by the Google Photos app. Theoretically, Samsung could bring HDR photos to the S23 Ultra since so much of the camera hardware is the same, but it hasn't announced any plans to do so. The S23 still can shoot 10-bit HDR videos, of course, just not stills. So HDR aside, how do these two shape up? Well, it's worth talking first about color science, because even though most of these phones' cameras are identical, the S24's output isn't as saturation boosted as the S23's. The difference is subtle, but photos taken from the newer phone can have a more natural look to them, akin to the iPhone, versus the slight additional pop that you get from the S23. That's in contrast to the sometimes excessive additional pop that you get from more budget-oriented Samsung phones. But obviously the single biggest difference here is in telephoto performance, and first up, when taking photos at 5x, the S24 is shooting at its native focal length, whereas the S23 has to crop in on data from that relatively small 3x sensor. Most of the time in daylight that isn't a big deal, but if you go pixel peeping you can see some more artificial sharpening and less true fine detail being captured on the S23 image. When you get to 10x, it's largely a wash. The S24 is taking a digitally zoomed crop from its telephoto, but the sensor is so large and the resolution is so high that it's not appreciably any worse than the S23. And in fact, in low light, it can end up looking quite a bit better. Go zooming beyond 10x, for example, here at 25x, and although both phones produce a pleasant enough shot, you can see a little bit of color smudging, for example, in the worn areas of the green paint here. That area is much clearer in the image from the S23. You can see the same effect here in this shot of a statue. Both are fine-looking images, but I think the S23 pulls ahead with more fine detail being preserved and a slightly less blurry image. The other side of the coin is low light. Because the S24 has a much larger telephoto, it's easier for it to pull ahead even at longer zoom ranges when the lights go out. So I think 5x is a more sensible choice for a super telephoto camera given the level of improvement it brings in shots in that crucial 5 to 10x range. The trade-off of slightly worse long-range zoom for better close-range zoom is worth it in my opinion. Over on the video side, you can see the same range of benefits from that larger image sensor behind the 5x, a clearer image, better low-light performance. Though the footage produced by the S23 admittedly is also not too shabby, especially at its native 10x zoom level. So if you know where to look, you can definitely see an appreciable difference in camera zoom performance, especially in lower light. Ultimately though, these phones are so alike and the price difference between them so vast that I couldn't blame you for saving what is quite a lot of cash and just choosing the S23 Ultra over the S24 Ultra. And if you put that choice to me, that's probably the verdict that I'd come to. If in doubt, save your money and just get the S23. So much of what's great about the S24 Ultra also applies to its predecessor. The AI features that actually matter will be coming to the older phone. The design and performance for most things you're going to be doing are identical. And although I really appreciate a lot of the details like the reflectionless display, AI wallpapers, and having a really excellent low-light telephoto, I would be perfectly happy with an S23 Ultra and an extra $400 or $500 in my pocket. But that's just me. Let me know in the comments whether you agree, whether you'd pick the S24, even given the pretty large price difference between these two devices. Stick around for more comparisons coming soon. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.